Hi, this is Michael Williams speaking again, and now we're up to podcast number 8, Celestial Gardeners. Now, we understand that the stereotype of the Chinese market gardener is very common, and people should not misunderstand when something is declared a stereotype, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong, it just means that it's not as right as it should be, could be. So again, of course, there were plenty of Chinese market gardeners around, and they, in fact, at one stage there were perhaps 60% of all market gardeners in Australia, but that's well short of 100%. And as the discussion will mention, people wouldn't have died of scurvy had there not been any Chinese market gardeners, but still, nevertheless, they did do a good job of providing vegetables at a time when vegetables had to be grown fairly locally. And couldn't be transported over large distances, which is to say mostly in the late 19th, early 20th century. Now, we're talking about the market gardeners not as a stereotype, but particularly to see why people viewed how they viewed the Chinese market gardener as just that, a topic, almost a stick figure of the Chinese market gardener or the celestial gardener. The term celestial was common in the 19th century. It was not as harsh as some terms were, but it was certainly a patronising term. It came from a vague misunderstanding of some of the words for the Emperor of Heaven and connotations of the imperial government. And so people from China were commonly called celestials in 19th century Australia. And so I say we're going to discuss what people were called, why they were called these general names, and really given their own names, given names that would individualise them, and how this helps to create stereotypes and is part of that othering of people that was so important to a racist policy such as the White Australia policy, which was of course growing and being embedded in Australia in the late 19th, early 20th century. So I'll let our bots discuss this. This is an article that I wrote actually, and I'll talk about where you might find that article directly if you wish to look it up. Okay, and I hope you enjoy.
Welcome to the deep dive. Have you ever really stopped to think about where the fresh vegetables on Australian tables actually came from, say, a century or so ago?
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? Because the answer reveals this, well, often overlooked, but really crucial part of Australia's past.
Yeah, and that's what we're diving into today. We're looking at the huge role that Chinese market gardeners played in keeping Australians supplied with fresh produce, especially from the late 1800s into the early 1900s.
And what makes this whole story so striking is that this vital contribution was happening right alongside the doubly racist White Australia policy.
It's a real paradox. They were essential for fresh food, but at the same time faced this intense prejudice.
Exactly. So our mission today really is to unpack this complex history.
And we're doing that by looking closely at reports from agricultural shows back then.
Right. These might seem like straightforward accounts, who won prizes for the biggest pumpkin or whatever,
Yeah.
but they actually give us incredible insights.
Insights into both, kind of the high regard for the quality of their produce.
And they're really discriminatory attitudes towards the actual growers. It's all there in the language.
So, as you think about the history of Australian food, well, the origins of your veggies 100 years ago, it's a more complicated and frankly fascinating story than you might think.
hmm And the scale of their contribution, it's pretty remarkable. Now, you sometimes hear claims like, Europeans would have all gotten scurvy without them.
Right, which is probably an exaggeration.
Yeah, likely an overstatement. I mean, not all market gardeners were Chinese, but the numbers are still significant. At their peak, maybe around 60% of vegetable growers in Australia were of Chinese origin.
Wow, 60%?
Yeah, even though, interestingly, less than half of the Chinese population here actually worked as market gardeners. It really shows how specialized and important their role was in this specific area.
And this wasn't some hidden thing, right? It was quite visible at the time.
Oh, absolutely. If you look at the sources, these rural agricultural show reports from the late 19th century onwards, Chinese growers pop up constantly.
So they were there showing their produce.
Yep, displaying their vegetables and winning a lot of prizes, too, across many different categories.
Okay, so they're successful. Their produce is clearly top-notch.
Exactly. But like you said, this success is happening within a society that's actively trying to define itself as white. And that tension, it really comes through in how these successful gardeners were actually described in those reports.
Right. Let's get into that. How are they represented? Because it seems like the reports often go out of their way not to name them individually.
That's a key pattern. You see phrases like a Chinese or the Chinese, Chinaman, sometimes even a celestial or just the generic John.
John Chinaman.
Right. And this is totally different from how European competitors were treated, or they're almost always named, Mr. Smith, Mr. Jones.
So it's a deliberate sort of erasing of their individuality.
It certainly feels that way. When you constantly use these collective, often dismissive terms, it strips them of their personhood, doesn't it? You stop seeing them as individuals with specific skills.
And the show reports give us some pretty clear examples of this.
Oh, yeah. Take the 1872 Hamilton Agricultural Show. The report just says, John Chinaman had some splendid cabbages. John Celery also was a good exhibit.
Just John. No last name, no Mr.
Nope. Then 1877 North Gippsland Show. A prize winner is described merely as an irritable little Chinaman.
Wow. Just casually throwing in prejudice like that.
It's quite stark. And look at the 1882 Crookwell Agriculture Show report. It says, the prize for best collection of vegetables fell to a celestial. Very impersonal. But then right after, the second prize winner is named Mr. Grunsel.
So the contrast is right there. A celestial versus Mr. Grunsel.
Couldn't be clear. Even as late as 1894, Bathurst Agricultural Show, the report mentions George Trevitt and Chinese gardeners took most of the prizes. Again, lumping all the Chinese growers together.
But it wasn't always total anonymity, was it? Sometimes they were named.
That's true, and that's where it gets even more nuanced. There are cases where they're named, but, well, the way it's done can still feel a bit condescending.
How so?
Well, look at 1874, back in Hamilton again. The report mentions Mr. J. Wiggins and Ayuk the Chinaman, dividing the honors between them. So Ayuk is named.
Okay.
But then the report includes this supposed quote from Ayuk, Agricultural Show Willie Good Me Sabby.
Oh, like mimicking broken English.
Exactly. It just screams patronizing attitude from the reporter, right?
Yeah.
It underlines that bias.
Definitely. What about other examples of naming?
Well, in 1890, the Northern Horticultural Show in Tasmania notes that a Chinaman named Chung Gon was the most successful exhibitor. So that's a direct naming, which seems positive.
Okay.
But then the report also mentions the show categories were divided into open to all and amateurs only.
Which makes you wonder.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if that was maybe a way to sort of separate out the professional growers, like maybe Chung Gon was considered as professional, from the amateurs. A way to acknowledge skill, but still keep things separate.
Interesting thought. Did naming become more common later on?
It seems like it, gradually.
Yeah.
Later in the 1890s, we see more examples. Chin at the Borough Show in 1895. Ma Hua and Cheng Bing at the Bundaberg Show, same year. Hop Hua at the Horsham Show in 1898.
So maybe a slow, slightly uneven shift towards recognizing them as individuals, at least in print.
Potentially. But it leads to this really interesting paradox.
Which is?
Well, even while they're often being de-individualized, treated as this nameless group, their actual skill, their expertise in growing vegetables was widely acknowledged.
Right. They were almost seen as the benchmark.
Pretty much the standard others were measured against. You see this weird tension, the racist impulse to treat them as other, but also the undeniable reality of just how good they were at this.
Got an example?
Yeah, the 1883 Gallner Agriculture Show report is perfect. It actually suggests local farmers should, and I quote, get a few Chinese on their rich-soiled riverbanks to show them how it is done.
Wow. So admitting their superiority, but still framing them as sort of a resource to be used.
Exactly. Less like equals, more like tools to improve European farming.
And wasn't there something about show rules changing too?
Yes, same year, 1883 Wollongong Show. The organizers changed the rules specifically to stop non-growers exhibiting vegetables that were, quote, grown by Chinamen.
So people were basically buying vegetables from Chinese gardeners and passing them off as their own.
It seems like it, which clearly shows how recognized the quality was, right?
Yeah.
Their produce was seen as superior, maybe even had a higher market value.
So the economic reality, the quality of the goods was kind of clashing with the social prejudice.
Absolutely. The produce was valued, maybe even sought after, but the growers themselves, still marginalized. And this reputation for excellence lasted. Even in 1930, way past the peak, a Horsham Agricultural Show report said some exhibits would have done credit to a Chinese gardener.
Still the benchmark, even decades later.
Yep.
But that underlying prejudice, the racism, it didn't just vanish, did it? There were more overt examples, too.
Oh, definitely. It wasn't always subtle condescension. Look at 1892. The Berriedale Pastoral and Agricultural Association actually passed a motion to exclude Chinese members and competitors entirely.
Just outright exclusion.
And a contemporary observer at the time nailed it, saying, this is simply the outcome of prejudice. It wasn't about skill or competition. It was purely about race.
And the language could get pretty nasty, too, couldn't it?
Very nasty. That 1896 Bundaberg report describing Malwa, it's really hostile. It talks about this district has been so long accustomed to the Mongolian sweeping the prize board with his cabbagee, etc.
Mongolian, cabbagee, just dripping with contempt.
It really is.
Right.
And you also see this clear us versus them attitude developing in some places, like the Dubbo Show reports in the early 20th century.
How did that show up?
Well, European fruit growers would be named individually, but when it came to vegetables, the prizes were mostly just attributed to Chinese gardeners as a group.
Ah, okay.
And then in 1907, you see Mo He and Quang Li entering a separate market gardeners prize.
Yeah.
It suggests maybe a formal segregation, acknowledging their distinct, maybe professional status, but keeping it separate.
That just highlights that constant strain, that contradiction. You've got this grudging, sometimes open respect for their essential skill.
Right alongside this deep-seated racism and refusal, in many cases, to fully acknowledge them as individuals.
Yeah, that strain feels really palpable in some of the later sources, too.
It does. There's a 1909 Royal Agricultural Show report talking about pumpkins and beans that were, quote, good enough to brighten the eye and gladden the heart of the most pessimistic celestial.
Ugh. Even when praising the veggies, they have to use that distancing, kind of cartoonish term.
Exactly. And then there's that really extraordinary story from the 1911 Molon Show.
What happened there?
Well, the prize for the best vegetable collection was won by someone described as a white man Chinaman.
A white man. Chinaman, what does that even mean?
It seems he was just a very skilled white vegetable grower, but his skill level was so associated with Chinese gardeners that they literally labeled him a Chinaman, albeit a white one.
That's incredible. It just shows how deeply embedded that racial categorization was, hasn't it? Skill itself became racialized.
It really does. And apparently this white man, Chinaman, then donated both his prize money and all the vegetables to the local hospital.
Wow. But the label itself?
The label itself speaks volumes about the attitudes of the time. And this all feeds into the bigger picture, right? The whole context of the White Australia policy, the hardening attitudes towards non-whites.
Which ultimately contributed to the decline in the Chinese population in Australia.
Yeah. Despite their absolutely essential contributions to the food supply, they faced systemic discrimination on so many levels.
Okay, so wrapping this up, if someone's listened to this deep dive, what are the main things they should, take away?
I think the core takeaway is just how significant and often prize-winning the contribution of Chinese market gardeners was to Australian horticulture back then. They were vital for fresh vegetables.
And the quality was recognized, even set the standard.
Absolutely. That's takeaway number one.
But number two is that this happened against a backdrop of pervasive racism.
Exactly. Their individual identities were often erased. They were referred to in these dehumanizing general terms. That contrast is key.
This sort of aha moment might be realizing that even in that hostile environment, their skill was just so undeniable.
That couldn't be completely ignored. They were essential, even if they weren't treated with the respect they deserved.
And considering this history, it really makes you think, doesn't it? About how we look at history in general.
For sure. You start wondering, how might the contributions of other marginalized groups be similarly overlooked or, misrepresented in our standard historical narratives?
What other essential parts of our society, things we take for granted, might have these really complex, maybe uncomfortable, under-acknowledged origins?
It's definitely something to chew on. Maybe think about the stories behind the food you eat, but also broader questions about who gets recognized for their contributions and why.
A lot to think about. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Okay, I think you'll find that, hope you found that an interesting discussion of an aspect of kind of casual, you call it casual racism, where people's individuality were dismissed and they were simply grouped together into this amorphous idea of the celestial gardener or the Chinese market gardener or John in some instances. Not always, and you can see things were gradually changing, but it takes a long time for these things to change. And I'd like to emphasise that this is something that was ongoing even in Australian history today, this whitewashing of Chinese in Australia. And one aspect of that is simply assuming that gold miners and market gardeners is all there is to China's Australian history. But if you listen to the other podcasts in the series, past and future, you'll find that that's certainly not the case. So this particular discussion was based on an article I wrote for the journal History in September 2022, entitled "Vegetables Varied and Excellent, Chiefly from a Celestial Garden." If you can't find that on the web yourself, write to me at Child Study Press at gmail.com, and I'll send you a copy if you like, or show you where you can find that. And I hope you enjoyed the podcast today. Thank you very much for your attention.